And thank you all for being here on this wonderful occasion celebrating 20 years since Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was moved. My name is BETT PADGETT, past president of the Outer Banks Lighthouse Society. It's wonderful to be here and see so many familiar faces from 20 years ago. I, like many of you, was in the crowd who cheered as the orange cone toppled to the ground, signifying that our gentle giant was 5 feet closer to safety. It's an honor to be here. We have an exciting program this morning with many interesting speakers, so let's get underway. I'd like to first introduce Dave Halleck, the superintendent for the National Parks of Eastern North Carolina. He manages Cape Hatteras National Seashore, Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, and the Wright Brothers National Memorial. Welcome, Superintendent Halleck.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I am so hot, but I also feel cooler than I have felt in a long time. I have had 3 people come up to me and ask me for my autograph. So I've never felt so hot and cold at the same time. It is a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Today is a great day of learning and remembrance. The action that the Park Service took 20 years ago was both bold and decisive and based on science, and it resulted in the preservation of this incredible resource behind us. I'm going to ask all of you to do one thing before you leave today. I hope you can stay through the entire presentation. If you do, wonderful. If you leave early, before you get back in your car and take off, do one thing for me. Go down to the old lighthouse parking lot and walk out onto the beach, and you will see something special there. Thanks to John Havel, one of our friends, one of the most knowledgeable, where is John? One of the most knowledgeable, hardworking, enthusiastic, happy, cheerful, and funny supporters of Cape Hatteras Seashore. He has done something that we have failed to do in 20 years, and that is to help us mark the original site of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. And John is so modest that he insists on also thanking our staff for digging the hole for the pylon, but really John is responsible for that. Please go out there, spend a few moments. It's really peaceful. It's incredible to think about the accomplishment that we've made. I'd like to recognize Bob Woodard, chairman of the Dare County Board of Commissioners, Danny Couch, commissioner from the Dare County Board of Commissioners, Dr. Stan Riggs from Eastern Carolina University, Beth Padgett, past president of the Outer Banks Lighthouse Society, who's helping us here today. Bob Woody, retired park ranger. Terry Ann Jeanette Ponton, granddaughter of LINAKA JENNETTE, who is the last keeper of the lighthouse. Dr. Robert Young from Western Carolina University. Mike Boer, photographer for The Move. Joe Jakubik, project manager, International Chimney Corporation. Jerry Matiko, Principal Expert House Movers. Wally Overman, Commissioner, Dare County Board of Commissioners. Rob Ross, Dare County Board of Commissioners. And Lee Nettles from the Outer Banks Visitors Bureau. It's such a great day to be here. I'm going to go and sit down, and I'm so lucky to have a seat with all of you in front so we can listen to these great speakers today, hear their stories, and learn from them. This move is so important to me for 2 reasons. First of all, it's inspiring. This tells us all if we put our minds, science, and hard work and engineering to something, we can move lighthouses, we can move mountains, we can do amazing things. This is also a testament to the local community. Anybody that's lived in the Outer Banks for the last several hundred years knows that this sandbar that we're living on moves. It moves quite a bit. It ebbs, it flows, it erodes, and it accretes. And if you're not willing to roll with the punches and to move your structures and your houses and your roads, then you will be dead in the water and things will not happen well for your society. So I really think of the Lighthouse move as a testament to the culture, the grit, the boldness, and the inspiration of the local community. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today, and I look forward to the program.
Thank you, Dave.
Our first speaker is Scott BABINOWICH, Acting Chief of Interpretation for the Outer Banks Group of the National Park Service. Scott is new to the Outer Banks, having just moved here 3 months ago, but he's not new to the Park Service or to interpretation. For the past 13 years, Scott helped educate and connect visitors with some of our most iconic national parks, such as the Grand Canyon and the Black Hills of South Dakota. Scott is permanently stationed at Vicksburg National Military Park in Mississippi, and he's felt greatly honored to be the Outer Banks community during his temporary assignment. Scott, we're happy to have you here on the Outer Banks, and hope you can stay a long time.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I always joke one of the worst things you can do is give an interpreter a microphone and a stage, because I talk for a profession, so I'm going to do my best to stick to my talking points. But that introduction says it perfectly. I am so honored to be here in the Outer Banks this summer, but also here at this very special event. 20 years ago, this community bore witness to an amazing engineering feat. The 198-foot tall Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was moved 2,900 feet from its original location to where it stands today. Moving the 5,000-ton brick structure was not easy. It took 23 days to slowly move the lighthouse, just 5 feet at a time, and was put atop its new foundation on July 9th, 1999. July 1st, today, is a very important day in that move, because what happened here 20 years ago was the lighthouse took its farthest journey along that trip in a single day. Actually covered over 350 feet on July 1st. It's hard to imagine looking at that behind us today and seeing that move 350 feet in a single day. But that's what happened, and that's why July 1st is a very important day. It took over 15 years of scientific study and over 1 year of physical prep work to prepare for the move, with countless of individuals from across the country contributing to this amazing effort. Moving the lighthouse was challenging. Something like this had never been done before. Throughout the morning, we will hear from people who made this possible. You will hear stories of resilience, adaptation, ingenuity, and passion that came together here in Buxton to save one of the most iconic and most important symbols of the Eastern Seaboard. The decision to move the lighthouse was not an easy one, and one that was not made quickly. The National Park Service began studying the threats to the lighthouse over 35 years ago. The shape of the shoreline in the Outer Banks is constantly changing, and by the late 1980s, the ocean had gotten so close that storm waves would hit the base of the lighthouse. In 1988, the National Academy of Sciences put forth 10 different recommendations to save the lighthouse. The National Park Service engaged local universities and partners like the Army Corps of Engineers to try and stabilize the shoreline. But as we know, the Outer Banks are constantly in flux, and by the late 1990s, the ocean was a mere few hundred feet from the base. It was time to act to save history. The speakers this morning will help connect you to the amazing teamwork and ingenuity that worked together to save the lighthouse and its place in this wonderful community. By moving the lighthouse, we did not just save a brick structure. We saved the stories and ideals that it represents. From the stories of the families that kept the light shining, to the bravery of the U.S. Life-Saving Service, to the harrowing moments of the 2 world wars, to the stories of moving the lighthouse, to the wonderful memories made by the thousands of vacationers each year. This lighthouse has become a silent witness to the history of the Outer Banks. The lighthouse is a beacon of humanity, and preserving it will allow many generations to come to make the same connections, to feel the same feelings you and I are experiencing today. It is the mission of the National Park Service not just to preserve and protect amazing national treasures such as this lighthouse, but to allow their stories to transcend time and to continue to inspire us for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Bob Woodard, current chair of the Dare County Board of Commissioners. Commissioner Woodard is a native of Virginia, but has lived in Kill Devil Hills for over 25 years and has served in a variety of leadership positions.
Good morning, Hatteras Island. It is one fabulous day. Can you believe this weather? Superintendent Halleck, I don't know how you do it, brother, but you brought the weather to us. I don't care how heavy that coat is you got on. I thought this morning, I said, I'm going to go down there. I thought it was going to be kind of hot and so forth, so I didn't wear my typical bow tie this morning, but I got to hand it to Bob Woody here. He's taking over for me. Those suspenders and that bow tie, Bob, super. You're looking sharp. I like bow ties. Man, looks great this morning. First of all, Superintendent Halleck and distinguished guests, thank you all for having me here to speak this morning. I'm here, as Superintendent Halleck said, with my fellow Board of Commissioners, Vice Chairman Wiley Overman, also Commissioner Rob Ross, and the Lone Ranger down here in Hatteras Island, Mr. Couch, better known as historian of Hatteras Island. He's got some great words to share with you in a few minutes, I'm sure. The Dare County Board of Commissioners staunchly support efforts to protect Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. That was true some 20 years ago, and that commitment certainly continues today. Our board treasures the relationship with the National Park Service, and we deeply respect you, Superintendent Halleck, for your leadership and your vision for this park. We're confident that whatever the future may bring right here on this ground that we're sitting on and standing on today for Cape Hatteras Lighthouse and for our community, we can bravely face it by working together and finding creative solutions to do so. Such as one we celebrate today as we commemorate what I call the move of the century. What a great day to celebrate the move of the century. Certainly on behalf of our board, it's my honor to join with the Outer Banks Lighthouse Society, the Outer Banks Forever. 20 years ago, the National Park Service embarked on a daring venture that many thought was just totally impossible. They had the vision to look ahead, take a bold step to preserve and protect this Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. They recognized that this historic landmark, which had proudly protected the Atlantic mariners for centuries, continues to serve as a beacon of light in guiding our way to the future. So once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for this great celebration. And thank you for commemorating the move of the century. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Stanley Riggs, Distinguished Research Professor of Geology at East Carolina University in Greenville, where he has worked for 51 years. Dr. Riggs' expertise is in barrier island dynamics and sea level change, and he has consulted with the National Park Service to document shoreline change in the Cape Hatteras area. So, Dr. Riggs?
Welcome to the goodliest land on earth. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse does not stand alone. It is part of a much bigger, more complex coastal system. Give me a few minutes to sort of step back to 1962, to the Ash Wednesday storm, which was a brutal storm. It pounded not just North Carolina, but the whole East Coast. It was opened an inlet just to the north of us called Buxton Inlet, at a place where the Haulover, they dug a canal around through there, and the Phipps Hunt Club was sitting there. And that inlet came right through that canal. It was a big inlet, produced a very major flood tide delta. It was decided afterwards to build a bridge over it. They built a wooden bridge. By December 1962, the bridge was taken out by a nor'easter. And so they said, let's fill it. That inlet, that little inlet, had already built a major flood tide delta. And they dug the sand out of that flood tide delta to fill the inlet. And there's still a hole there. We call it Canadian Hole. But that was, out of that, after from 62 to 69, the coast was very vulnerable. It kept moving. Any structures up here in Buxton were in jeopardy. They decided to pump 2 beach nourishment projects out of the backside, the fine sands off the backside. Those linear ditches are still there today underwater. They didn't last because the sand was too fine. The energy's too high. By 1969, the lighthouse was pretty close to the edge of the water. The naval station was in trouble. The naval station decided to build a steel jetty. Well, everybody with any sense knew that one jetty would cause upstream, downstream erosion. And the park said, no, you need to build 2, 3 jetties to protect the lighthouse. So now we have a jetty headland. And that jetty headland has controlled everything since, along with what DOT has done. Anytime you have a headland, you'll end up with a cuspate shoreline upstream and downstream if it's a sand beach. So south of the jetty headland, the beach was allowed to go natural. And we ended up, within a few years, taking out the base of the old 1802 lighthouse, which was in the late 70s to early 80s. And then it kept going. Recently, it's taken out the overwash, a whole series of the ramps down at the bottom, out towards the Cape Point, jeopardizing the campground, forcing changes in the whole system. And today, just to the south, when you go up that lighthouse, notice that incredible cusp in the shoreline. Well, to the north of the jetty would have done exactly the same thing, except humans decided they didn't want it. So the hotels, we built a series of hotels and bulkheads, which are basically bulkheads. A house on the beach is a bulkhead. And we built a string of those. DOT came in there, and they built these big dune dikes, these incredible dune dikes. So here is the narrowest part of the island, which naturally works as an overwash system, building up the backside of the island as we prograde through time. The sea level has come up between 2 and 3 feet since the European colonists came here in 1584. And as that water comes up, the shoreline's got to move. But we decided we didn't want the shoreline to move. So DOT in the mid-1900s built a road. That road has been moved back 4 times since then. The dune dikes have gotten bigger and bigger. So what started out in 1969 as a straight shoreline now has a highly engineered shoreline from Avon to the jetty and a natural cuspate shoreline from the jetty to Cape Point. 2 very different responses to the natural changes of the island. Now, when they built the lighthouse in 1870, there was a major government survey in 1852. It took them 20 years to survey. It was a beautiful survey. They knew exactly. They did a lot of fishing, but they did a lot of really detailed surveying. And that was 1852. When they finished the lighthouse in 1870, they were 2,500 feet behind that 1852 survey, right next to the base of this 1802 lighthouse. By the time we moved the lighthouse here in 2000, we're 3,000 feet behind that 1852 survey. They surveyed, when they finished this lighthouse in 1870, they surveyed it in 1872. These are excellent surveys. And we have 1917, we have 1965, we have probably 10 beautiful shorelines showing the systematic change through time. The erosion of this east-facing coast and the building and construction of the south-facing coast. The south-facing coast is what built all of the Buxton Ridges, which go back to about 2,000 years ago. The one that's furthest or closest to the Sound, 2,000 years ago. And we've been building that since. On this shore over here, we've been losing it. And that's driven by the storm dynamics and sand supplies. And I don't have time to give you any more of the details, but I have lots of maps and aerial photos to share with you. Well, since the jetties were built, we built a steel wall around it. We put in incredibly big rock bulkheads. We put in sandbags. I don't know how many different colors of sandbags I have photographs of through time. And then in 1973, if I remember right, they dug up the parking lot and put it out there. All that rubble's still out there on the beach. You can see every bit of it. There's a long history, even though the jetties were there, there's a long history of trying to protect the lighthouse till finally, 69, we said. And that was an important step because there were decades of debate before that of yes and no and pros and cons. And then there was a lighthouse committee that made a decision that the scientific community knew from day one, as long as there have been scientists working out here, that you're going to have to move with the system. You have to learn to live with the system. But getting that into the public domain and understanding the dynamics was taken over by, in a large extent, by greed and the interest in sort of static, engineering that shoreline. So we have a incredible conflict, what I call the perfect conflict between humans and the natural dynamics on a mobile, moving barrier island system. 15,000 years ago, this barrier island would have been 410 feet below sea level off the edge of the continental shelf out there. How do we know that? We know that because we've been there. And we know exactly how this shoreline has changed through time to where it is right now. And the science panel for North Carolina, which had 19 of the best scientists in the country on the panel, estimated that it would be by 2100 for CRC that we would have a possible 3 more feet or 1 meter rise of sea level, plus or minus. There's some potential air in there and so forth. But think about the rate at which things are changing right now. We have lots of cultural history that documents those rates of change. We have whole sounds that have formed, inlets that have opened and closed. We have foundations that are underwater, etc. It's not a question of is it rising? It is. How fast, how far? You tell me how fast, how far, and I'll tell you what you've got, and I'll end on this. You've got a beautiful indicator species right here. You've got this lighthouse sitting in the midst of this beautiful maritime forest. Maritime forests do not like salt water. Your live oaks do not like salt water. When you see those live oaks starting to go sour, you better think about the lighthouse. It probably will have to be moved again. But for now, think about it as living with a dynamic coast. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Bob Woody, who worked for the National Park Service's Public Information Officer during the move of the lighthouse. As such, he had to deal with countless media requests and inquiries from visitors all over the world, and the Hatteras Island locals, who were very vocal in their desire to see the lighthouse moved or not. He handled all inquiries with humor and patience and during this exciting and exhausting time. Bob.
Thank you, Beth. In honor of Mr. Woodward's recognition of my bow tie and suspenders, I decided to leave my jacket off. And there's some background reasons for that too. But bow ties and suspenders are the prerogative of older and wiser people. Isn't that right?
And good looking.
That too, but you're required to be good looking to be a park ranger, and I was a park ranger, so it was already there. I'm going to tell you about me and the lighthouse. I was raised and educated K through 12 in North Carolina. But for the life of me, I don't remember ever learning or even hearing about the Outer Banks or Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. When I finished high school, I went up to Raleigh to attend NC State University. I did hear about the Outer Banks and the lighthouse there, but I never got down here. I was young, there was studying to be done, and it was a girls' school only 2 miles down the road. After graduation, I was hired by the National Park Service and sent to the Ranger Academy at Grand Canyon. At the end of that training, they gave us a sheet of paper with 10 spaces. They said it was our dream sheet, and we could write down the parks that we wanted to be assigned to when we left the training academy. I wrote down Cape Hatteras 10 times. It didn't happen. Several of my classmates were assigned here, but they sent me down to the Everglades, which prepared me for the mosquitoes when I finally got to Cape Hatteras. It was seven assignments later, in 1981, that I finally arrived at Cape Hatteras, and I finished my career here. The first thing I learned when I got here was that the good folks on the Outer Banks were very passionate about their issues. At the time, early 80s, the big issues were the condition of North Carolina Highway 12 and the Oregon Inlet jetties. Most of you who live down here can remember those. Things like dredging and protocols of the Old Bonner Bridge were things that sat on the back burner, along with the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse at that time. There were just other things that seemed to take up most of the time. But it wasn't long. The lighthouse issue came to the front burners mid-80s, and it stayed there for 15 years until the year 2000. Park Service asked the National Academy of Sciences to do a study on what the options might be to save the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. We knew what had to be done. At that time, the Park Service favored an in-place redevelopment. So we asked for the study. The study came back, and this is a critical study. This is a major mover of what happened after that. And if you want to see that study and read it, you can find it on the internet. Just Google up National Academy of Sciences, move of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and the whole document is there. There were 10 options, but the two main ones were an in-place redevelopment and relocation. Ultimately, as we know, the Park Service selected relocation or move. After the decision was made, of course, we made this decision, the Park Service, but we didn't have any money to make it happen. No funding came with the decision. We began planning, however, in the late 1980s with monies that had been appropriated for the in-place revetment. We got a little planning done, but most of that money went to other coastal Park Service areas that had their own issues with coastal erosion. Then in the late 90s, President Bill Clinton came down to North Carolina on one of his usual trips. And then State Senator Pro Tem Mark Bassnight got his ear and asked him to put a line item in his budget that he submitted to Congress for the move of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Congress passed that bill, or passed the budget that year, and left that move money in there. And while the move activities were underway, the federal courts ruled in favor of the National Park Service move in response to an injunction that was filed by the Dare County Commissioners to stop the move. Now, this was a rare moment. You got the executive branch, you've got the legislative branch, and with the court's decision, the judicial branch, all agreeing on something. That's not something you see very often, like these days. Well, the rest was history, but the adversarial nature of the dialogue was part of the mix, mainly in the press, which I had the pleasure of dealing with. Once the funding came through, the Park Service immediately got organized internally to handle this project, and I was tasked with the job of Public Information Officer. I came close to resigning. I had a job waiting for me that I'd have been herding feral cats at high noon, and I seriously considered doing that. But I stayed the course. The stories on the move were almost always contained an adversarial approach, because the lighthouse move was right down that alley for the reporters who like that kind of reporting. Now, at one point, as the move was occurring, expert housekeepers, I've got a B&B, and I refer to housekeepers an awful lot. Expert house movers invited the reporters that were there on press days to move the lighthouse themselves. The lighthouse was moved with hydraulic jacks that were controlled from a truck that followed alongside the lighthouse. Correct me if I'm wrong. They invited the reporters to come up. You'd grab this handle, it was on the back of a truck, and you'd push it down. You'd activate the hydraulic jacks. They would push the lighthouse 5 feet, and then they'd have to reset the jacks. So these reporters were crawling up there. There was plenty of them that wanted to do it. They wanted to be part of history. They climbed up there and moved the lighthouse. Some of those reporters were the same ones that were using an adversarial approach in what they wrote about the project. The irony wasn't lost on me. Those reporters, those very same reporters, now own 5 feet of that move. I told them I didn't want to hear them complaining anymore. They were part of the problem. My best remembrance, though, is about the people on this project. The men, the women, the park rangers, the park volunteers, the engineers, the planners, the managers, the supervisors, all the folks that did the heavy lifting and moving, and all the folks that did the not so heavy lifting. It was my privilege to be amongst their company and to be part of that group of people that got it. They knew what they were there for, they knew what their job was, and they realized that they were involved in a momentous task that would carry through the ages. It was a congenial assembly of people, and I was happy not only to know them, but to be part of their group. There was one point in the move where they were working so well together that they had gotten into this workplace routine. They were a well-oiled moving machine. Or maybe I will say a well-vegetable oiled moving machine. The Park Service wouldn't let them use petroleum products for the hydraulic fluid, so they used vegetable oil. That's for environmental reasons. One day they moved the lighthouse 355 feet. And as far as I know, that still stands as a world record for the furthest a lighthouse has moved in one day over land. The project was of some significance to the National Park Service. National Park Service, whose mission was mandated by legislation that created the agency, and that mission is one of preservation of natural and cultural resources and providing for the public enjoyment thereof. The project was important on a national, regional, and local level, demonstrating some of the givens of the concept of preservation. First, that the extraordinary cultural diversity of this nation is an important resource or source of inspiration for its citizens. Second, that preservation doesn't change the past, nor does it destroy our personal relationship with the old. Our cultural heritage cannot be extinguished or replaced. Third, it provided present and future generations with tangible evidence of the lives of important people and events linked, in this case, to this area, to this particular area. And finally, I'd like to read a portion of my quote from what I consider a definitive study of the project, a book called Out of Harm's Way, Moving America's Lighthouse by Mike Boer and Lynn Ezel. Mike is here today. If you book's out of print, you might find one on eBay. And maybe the Park Service will encourage their cooperating association to reprint that book. And I quote, "Saving the lighthouse was about passing along to future generations those symbols that embody values representative of the best of the American character. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is a vessel of the American experience, a symbol of the lighthouse keepers and their families and the way they live their lives. With dedication, with courage, commitment, care, and concern for their responsibilities and for the people who made their livelihood from the sea." Let me close with this final thought, and I hope you might take this back to the communities where you live and that is that history matters. History matters. And it spreads beyond just artifacts and structures and this lighthouse. Heritage conservation is who a community names its airports after. It's the games we played and play as children. It's the moonlight stories that we tell to our friends and families as we sit around a campfire or we sit around the kitchen table. And it's how we relate to one another in our society. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Terry Ann Jeanette Ponton is the closest thing we have to island royalty here. And she's the daughter of Ranny Jeannette and the granddaughter of LINAKA Jeannette, who is the last keeper of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse and the longest standing keeper of the same lighthouse. She has memories of growing up here and will also share those with us in a very personal way, what the move of the lighthouse meant to her and her family.
I stand here today very proud to represent my family. I know my grandfather would have been overwhelmed by all of this. I'd like to share a few memories and a few thoughts and let you know what was going on in our household during all of this time. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. My dad and his sisters were born in this house over here. They called it home. They played here, they grew here, they loved this place. But it was not in this place, it was in another place. It was very difficult for all of them to wrap their heads around the fact that you could move a lighthouse. It was conversations in our households for years. How are they going to do this? Is it going to fall down? What happens if there's a hurricane in the middle of the whole thing? These people are crazy. This will never happen. Do they have any idea how many bricks are in that thing? It was a very emotional time. And when my family they knew that we had an issue. We knew we had a problem. They had played baseball between the lighthouse and the beach when my dad and his sisters all lived out here. So think about it. It had really come knocking at the door. They knew something had to be done, but what was it going to be? My family was a very proud group. Heaven knows I have a cousin here today who could share some stories about how stubborn and proud the Jeannettes are and always have been. But as far as moving the lighthouse, they wanted it saved. That was the main thing. We wanted it to be safe. We wanted it not to be destroyed. I do know there were family members on all sides that were not having the same opinion. I remember going to my dad's cousin's house, who happened to be my godfather, and when I expressed my opinion on how I wanted the lighthouse saved and I thought the move was a good idea, he very somewhat politely asked me to leave his house. That is how volatile it was. There were folks who weren't speaking to each other. There were people who were very, very angry that someone would do this to them. But of course, we knew it had to be saved. That's the only thing that could have been done. And thank God the Park Service stepped in and did it, because 21 years ago, I did not think we'd be standing here today having this service. It really was to the point where if something didn't happen soon, it wasn't going to be here. And I want to say thank you to the Park Service. I want to say thank you to these gentlemen who were you saved it. There's no two ways about it. You saved my family's home. You saved my lighthouse. I always say it's mine. I just let the Park Service take care of it and do the maintenance on it for me. Thank you so much for all of your help, and thanks to all of you for letting me be here today and share this. And I know my granddaddy would be so proud that in his protecting of the lighthouse and caring for it all those years, it's doing exactly what it was doing then. It was taking care of the island. It brings people here every year. It supports our families. It takes care of us. And I am so happy to be here today, and thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Young, the director of the program for the study of developed shorelines at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee. He was present during the move of the lighthouse, along with many other academics, scientists, and engineers. He will share with us how the move of the Hatteras Lighthouse established the National Park Service as a leader in how conservationists and government agencies adapt to coastal changes.
Wow, that's a tough act to follow. I am so honored to be here today in Dare County and Hatteras Island with everybody, to be a part of this. I grew up in Tidewater, Virginia area, as did many folks who spent their childhoods down here on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. I certainly did. Nobody in their right mind who lives in Virginia goes to Virginia Beach. We all come down here. Always have. I've been coming down here since I was, 1960s, when all the houses were what the realtors called beach boxes, little rectangular things, right? One story on skinny legs. Most folks don't realize that we used to move those all the time. Moving structures is actually a big part of Outer Banks life going back. And that's true in a lot of places. The lighthouse in Hunting Island was moved 6 times after it was constructed in the 1800s. It was built to move, basically. It wasn't, it seems, until the last 2, maybe 3 decades that there's a pervasive expectation on the coast that things shouldn't move. That someone needs to take the responsibility to hold everything in place. And, the moving the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse has been and still is the poster child for what can be done and what can be moved, which is just about anything. Even, 25-bedroom homes like they build now up in the northern Outer Banks of North Carolina could eventually be moved. And the Park Service has really taken the lead in providing examples of how this could work for everybody in the country over the long run in so many different places. And the move of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is just a piece of that. And I've had the pleasure to work with the National Park Service for almost 15 years now on a wide variety of different projects, but mostly relating to helping the Park Service understand which of their assets, roads, buildings, cultural resources, are at risk to storms, rising sea level, flooding, and erosion. And what can we do about it? And the Park Service has taken such a leadership role. I want everybody to appreciate that moving the lighthouse, as fabulous of a project as it was, is just a piece of what the National Park Service has been doing around the country. From moving bathhouses in Cape Cod to building new concessionaires in Flamingo and the Everglades that are designed to be storm resilient, but also to be moved if they need to be moved, to Assateague Island National Seashore, where They actually have changing facilities, bathrooms, and other facilities that can be hauled off the island on a flatbed truck when a storm's coming in. There are a lot of great ideas coming out of the National Park Service and helping us understand how we can both live on the coast, preserve the coastal economy, and do it in a smart way that saves the things that we love, and at the same time, doesn't waste taxpayer money. And at the end of the day, it's finding that balance. And I think the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse really is still emblematic of that goal. I think if you look back at the way that the move was approached and what it cost and the general overwhelming good sentiments for the results of the move, what you see is a model that we need to be considering more widely in coastal municipalities, coastal areas, and coastal parks in our country. And I'm hoping that all of the goodwill and the fine results that we're discussing today can ultimately be exported to the way that we manage a lot of our threatened infrastructure and resources up and down the coast, but particularly here in my now home state of North Carolina. There are many places up and down the coast of North Carolina that it makes sense for us to take a little step back, as we did with the lighthouse. And I think everybody just needs to understand that if we take that little step back in the places that are costing us a lot of money to hold the shoreline in place, that's not shrinking the coastal economy. What it's doing is making it more sustainable. Because if we don't have to spend all of our time protecting something that's in harm's way, then we can spend more of our time and money protecting those things that we know we can sustain over the long run. And that's how we keep vital coastal communities in place and keep that economy going. I encourage y'all, when you're in the spirit of thinking about flexible management of our shoreline and moving some things out of harm's way, I encourage you to go to the Program for the Study of Developed Shorelines website. And up on the homepage today is this report that translates what the Park Service has been doing and the spirit of this move into what we think to be a very reasonable proposal for what municipalities could be doing to take a tiny step back from the hot spots of erosion in their communities so that they can use all of those resources to focus on preserving everything else that's sustainable about that community. And that's really what happened here. That's really what happened here. Moving that lighthouse guaranteed the preservation of this resource that's so important to everybody that is still bringing guests to this island. It guaranteed that. And we need to seriously think about how we can capitalize on that model and this goodwill to export that to the way we think about the coast in general. And it's not abandoning the barrier islands or the coastal economy. It's preserving it in a sensible way, in the way that lasts a long time. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Danny Couch, who really needs no introduction. Danny grew up here on Hatteras Island, is the unofficial island historian, and currently offers tours that share historic, cultural, and humorous insights to life here on the island. He currently serves as the Hatteras Islands representative on the Dare County Board of Commissioners. Danny, come share your stories.
Dr. Young, one of the dirty little secrets that I was aware of was that there was discussion of a buyout here, but they didn't have enough firepower to want to talk to some of the home folks about that. Some of you here in attendance today, it is really an honor for me to be here as well. Might recognize my name as one of the locals who was a fierce and outspoken critic of the move. So if you want to say something like, how'd that work out for you, brah? Now would be the appropriate time. I'm being sarcastic, John. Okay. I want to salute each and every one of you here today because this really is a story. Every person here has a deep personal relationship with this lighthouse. It's you and that lighthouse in many instances against the world. And I salute that. It's the same thing that was with me. This is the only home I've ever known. I've made a commitment, a passion just for talking with some of the old timers here and the compelling seat that this skinny little sandbar, very dynamic sandbar out at, 305 miles east of Jacksonville, Florida, has. And I want to share just a couple of memories. One in particular, I believe it was July 1st, 20 years ago, July 1st, 1999. I was running a gas station here in town, filling station, been in my family for a long time, the Lighthouse Service Center, and had a modified beach wrecker. So after working all day and raging heat in there, invariably having a concession from the park to be able to run out with this beach wrecker and pull people off the beach, I was going to get a call from somebody who tried to make a submarine out of their Suburban. And that's what happened this particular night. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I got a call to go get this guy. But it was, as I was coming down toward the four-way, there was a four-way intersection over here at the time, and I was just marveling at what a gorgeous, wild, Hatteras dark sky night that it was. You had the moon coming up. Those of you who are familiar with some of the processes between cooler air and warmer water out here, with the hot water of the Gulf Stream, there was a huge cloud bank coming up over the Gulf, and you could see the moon, the backlight of the moon coming up. The Milky Way was just gloriously illuminated. You could see big stars and shooting stars. That's one of the really nice things we have here with our dark sky. But I'm just kind of, digging on this, and I come around the corner, and there's the freaking lighthouse right in the intersection. And I mean, this guy out there, he's gonna have to wait because it blew me away. I was just like everybody down here. We're working our rear ends off. You got 9 months to make a living here, and I didn't have a chance to get out here during the days. Just a little bit on a side note, if you couldn't make money, if you were in small business, if that's your thing, if you couldn't make money while they were moving that light, you were lazy. I was running that filling station. There were 4 of us in there. It's a gas station now. It's like Mayberry over there, Goober. We grossed over 7 figures, well over $1 million in a filling station. I built a house out of it and went to Disney World twice. So it really was just a huge economic boon. And to be perfectly honest with you, there was a large segment in the community that realized what a great opportunity that was. Controversy can be a great stimulus. And the longer this went on, we were just rolling in the money. That's the one indelible image that I will have, is just this backdrop of this really major, just absolutely phenomenal. It was hard to grasp around. I mean, a lot of local people, everybody up here fancies themselves as amateur coastal geologists. I was one class away from minoring in geology. I had the pleasure of having Dr. Riggs when I was in East Carolina for three classes. One is a guest speaker, but two, environmental geology and coastal barrier island dynamics, coastal processes. So again, he might say, how'd that work? I tried trying to tell you, you know, but you know, apparently you weren't listening. And yes, it was. Oftentimes, it was a tenuous relationship that we had. You know, I had been asked many times. I have a deep appreciation for Dr. Pilkey. I saw him here earlier. My dad went to Duke, but he would. Oh, yes, sir. He would show up at the gas station every now and then, and would talk a little bit with my dad about, you know, Duke stuff, and but just the relationships that came out of it. I think there was some, even though this was tenuous, that's the best word I can come up with, relationship here. You know, why people are trying to wrap their heads around why the local people took so long to get on board. And I really, the only explanation I can give you for that is if you will just take a moment to visit these stones that are over here on the eastern side of the parking lot over here, and you see, thanks to our friends with the Outer Banks Lighthouse Society, you see those names from 1802 right up until Captain LNAKA there, 1933. Imagine yourself as being a direct descendant of one of those guys. My good friend Bruce Roberts had one of the greatest, and I use this in my tours all the time, he called the United States Lighthouse Service the most efficient bureaucracy this country's ever known. And it really was. The American people got so much for their money out of them. There was somebody on those lights every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And a lot of the local people here made up a lot of those people who were toting sometimes 4, 5 times a day, 2, 1 in each hand, 5-gallon barrels. Those things are 40 pounds each. So, you know, they didn't have orthopedic surgeons back then, but a lot of these guys were ready for hips and knees after a career of doing that. I do want to just acknowledge some of the personalities running that gas station. I had the pleasure of developing relationships with a lot of guys here. One of the early things I remember walking in here, just, you know, 45 minutes ago, I smelled cigar smoke, and I took a look at Jerry Matico, and he didn't have one. So I said, Mike Boer is somewhere around here, and I'm sure he is. That was, but there was so many larger than life characters that were going on with this very, very powerful personalities, very committed. But there was a mutual respect with the folks from Expert House Movers, the folks from International Chimney. Each understood where the other side was coming from, and I was very grateful, my brother and I, that International Chimney and Expert House Movers both had a gas account over at my gas station. And you know, if you guys ever want to come stay in the house that the Lighthouse Move built back here in Buxton Woods, you are certainly welcome. I want to give just a little shout out to a gentleman by the name, and he is a Southern gentleman, Carolina gentleman, a guy by the name of Skelly Hunt. And Skelly was one of the project managers here. He was a native North Carolinian. I think Joe felt he would be useful being a Carolina guy, but he and I got pretty tight. We had some mutual friends down in that area. But Skelly, I mean, he set a record here for most flat tires in the summer. And I'm like, Skelly, son, there ain't no nails in that project out there. Not many. What are you doing? He goes, I got to deal with the press. And you just go ahead and knock these guys out of the way and go ahead and plug my tires. So ended up selling him a set of tires. He had this newer Cadillac. And but I enjoyed the relationship that I had with him. 87-year-old night watchman, and I give Joe the credit on that. They let a Kenny Keeter by the name of Mr. Willard Gray. He was the night watchman out here, 87 years old. I think that kind of underscored the fact that they weren't too worried about a whole lot of carrying-ons going on out here. But I came in one night, it was around 11, and talked with Willard there in the trailer, work trailer, project trailer. And he told me that this was a full circle for him because he had been involved in all three of the parks here. That's what is unique here is that we have three parks within the Cape Hatteras group. We've got Fort Raleigh, of course, the birthplace of English-speaking America. We got the Wright brothers, and then of course the granddaddy of American lighthouses. And speaking of stealing lines to use in small business, that belongs to our friend Joe Jakovic here. He called the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse the granddaddy of American lighthouses, and that's exactly what it is. There's three maritime symbols in this country that are instantaneously recognizable. Number one, bring us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free, the Statue of Liberty. Number two, running from the Presidio across to Marin County there where the redwoods are, San Francisco Bay, Golden Gate Bridge, and then of course Joe's granddaddy of American lighthouses, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Those are the three symbols. Also, and I'm going to wrap up here, Mr. Hugh Morton, he was a very prominent North Carolinian, highly organized guy. I will forever be grateful. He was the guy behind Save Cape Hatteras Lighthouse by preserving it where it is. But when it was all said and done, and there was about $300 and some odd thousand left over from the monies they raised, they gave those monies to the community here in the form of the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum down here, one of North Carolina's three maritime museums. And that donation at that time pretty much saved that project. You know, this might be a $1.2 billion economy out here in Dare County, but you know, the time it takes us, if we were to leave right now and drive to Charlotte, you know, call it 7 hours, we can leave right here and go due north. You've gone through Hampton Roads, Richmond, DC, Annapolis, Baltimore, Philly. You're half an hour outside of Manhattan. We pretty much don't care what North Carolina thinks because we got everybody else. They're coming here. One last thing, I want to give a shout out to a guy that I didn't know him that well. I had two interactions with him. A guy who was out in the forefront of this early on. His name was Dave Fischetti, and he was one of the project engineers, but he was one of the voices there early on that were teaming here to move this. And I had an opportunity to speak. They had a congressional hearing here in Roanoke Island. And of all times, I mean, it was right there in August, and the rains were literally monsoonal. Umbrella on the Outer Banks, that's kind of, you know, they're useless. What you needed was hip waders because it had rained so hard it was ponding. So I shot across the parking lot, and sure enough, it was shin deep. I had a suit on. I was soaked, smelled like my dog. Got in there, and I noticed there's a man holding the door open. And I said, oh, where do I know that guy from? I know that guy. And but I walked in there and I thanked him. He said, "You're welcome. Here's your sticker." So I took the sticker and I looked at it, and it said, "Move it or lose it." So I was a nanosecond away from telling him where he could put that sticker, and but he just had this disarming kind of smile on it, and I think that really kind of underscores to me that you know, these many years later, life is all about redemption. My faith is very important to me. Life is all about reconciliation, and it's okay to butt heads. I mean, we're human beings, you know, but you can do it. You can find common ground. You might not always agree, but you can find common ground. So that's my lighthouse story. What's yours? It needs to be told. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I really enjoyed that. So I was president of the Outer Banks Lighthouse Society for 10 years, but I'm also a music teacher in Raleigh and a singer-songwriter. And in 1997, the muse came to me to write a song about the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. And I thought, well, I really don't know anything about Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. I visited in 1980, but that's all I remember. So I had some research to do. I read a lot of books and visited the internet and even called how do you call a lighthouse? Well, I did. I called the lighthouse and was able to talk to Randy Jeanette, who was volunteering that day at the visitor center. And he told me all sorts of stories, what it was like growing up at the lighthouse and what was going on at that time in 1997 with people wanting it moved, not wanting it moved. And by the time the song was written, by the time the pen hit the paper, the lighthouse had written the song itself. It's called If a Lighthouse Could Speak. I am a lighthouse on North Carolina shore. I've stood strong to guard your coast 100 years and more. Once the waves crashed at my feet, with each storm they did rise. Now the spirals on my body won't fade into the tide. My father stood before me here, though not as strong as I. Witnessed many wrecks at diamond shoals, and so have I. Saw the ironclad Monitor and Spanish galleons in his day, and he was fired upon by both the blue and the gray. His body weakened with the war. It was clear that he was worn. So I was built in 1869, strong to take the storms. I am the tallest in the land. I tower above them all. I warn the sailors of the graveyard and guide them through the squalls. I watched the German warships take our tankers down. In 21 I watched the ghost ship as she ran aground. My beacon prisms were polished and cleaned with loving hands. Secrets I could tell you would warm the heart of any man. I am a lighthouse on North Carolina shore. I've stood strong to guard your coast 100 years and more. Once the waves crashed at my feet, with each storm they did rise. Now the spirals on my body, oh the spirals on my body, oh the spirals on my body won't fade into the tide. So I would like to thank the National Park Service, the Outer Banks Lighthouse Society, and Outer Banks Forever for hosting this event today and bringing us all together to recall the events that took place here 20 years ago.